2. The chorus of idle footsteps. The goddess can be recognized by her step. Virgil, Aeneid, Book 1. Their story begins on ground level, with footsteps. They are myriad, but do not compose a series. They cannot be counted because each unit has a qualitative character, a style of tactile apprehension and kinesthetic appropriation. Their swarming mass is an innumerable collection of singularities. Their intertwined paths give their shape to spaces. They weave places together. In that respect, pedestrian movements form one of these real systems whose existence in fact makes up the city. They are not localized. It is rather they that spatialize. They are no more inserted within a container than those Chinese characters speakers sketch out on their hands with their fingertips. It is true that the operations of walking on can be traced on city maps in such a way as to transcribe their paths, here well trodden, there very faint, and their trajectories, going this way and not that. But these thick or thin curves only refer, like words, to the absence of what has passed by. Surveys of routes miss what was, the act itself of passing by. The operation of walking, wandering, or window shopping, that is, the activity of passers-by, is transformed into points that draw a totalizing and reversible line on the map. They allow us to grasp only a relic set in the no-when of a surface of projection. Itself visible, it has the effect of making invisible the operation that made it possible. These fixations constitute procedures for forgetting. The trace left behind is substituted for the practice. It exhibits the voracious property that the geographical system has of being able to transform action into legibility, but in doing so it causes a way of being in the world to be forgotten. Pedestrian speech acts. A comparison with the speech act will allow us to go further, and not limit ourselves to the critique of graphic representations alone, looking from the shores of legibility toward an inaccessible beyond. The act of walking is to the urban system what the speech act is to language or to the statements uttered. At the most elementary level, it has a triple enunciative function. It is a process of appropriation of the topographical system on the part of the pedestrian, just as the speaker appropriates and takes on the language. It is a spatial acting out of the place, just as the speech act is an acoustic acting out of language. And it implies relations among differentiated positions, that is, among pragmatic contracts in the form of movements, just as verbal enunciation is an allocution, posits another opposite the speaker, and puts contracts between interlocutors into action. It thus seems possible to give a preliminary definition of walking as a space of enunciation. We could, moreover, extend this problematic to the relations between the act of writing and the written text, and even transpose it to the relationships between the hand, the touch and the tail of the paintbrush, le et la geste du pinceau, and the finished painting, forms, colors, etc. At first isolated in the area of verbal communication, the speech act turns out to find only one of its applications there, and its linguistic modality is merely the first determination of a much more general distinction between the forms used in a system and the ways of using this system, i.e., rules. That is, between two different worlds, since the same things are considered from two opposite formal viewpoints. Considered from this angle, the pedestrian speech act has three characteristics which distinguish it at the outset from the spatial system: the present, the discrete, the phatic. First, if it is true that a spatial order organizes an ensemble of possibilities, e.g. by a place in which one can move, and interdictions, e.g. by a wall that prevents one from going further, then the walker actualizes some of these possibilities. In that way, he makes them exist as well as emerge. But he also moves them about and he invents others, since the crossing, drifting away, or improvisation of walking privilege, transform, or abandon spatial elements. Thus, Charlie Chaplin multiplies the possibilities of his cane. He does other things with the same thing, and he goes beyond the limits that the determinants of the object set on its utilization. In the same way, the walker transforms each spatial signifier into something else. And if on the one hand he actualizes only a few of the possibilities fixed by the constructed order, he goes only here and not there. On the other, he increases the number of possibilities, for example, by creating shortcuts and detours, and prohibitions. For example, he forbids himself to take paths generally considered accessible or even obligatory. He thus makes a selection. The user of a city picks out certain fragments of the statement in order to actualize them in secret. He thus creates a discreteness, whether by making choices among the signifiers of the spatial language or by displacing them through the use he makes of them. He condemns certain places to inertia or disappearance and composes with others spatial turns of phrase that are rare, accidental, or illegitimate. But that already leads into a rhetoric of walking. In the framework of enunciation, the walker constitutes, in relation to his position, both a near and a far, a here and a there. To the fact that the adverbs here and there are the indicators of the locutionary seat in verbal communication, a coincidence that reinforces the parallelism between linguistic and pedestrian enunciation, we must add that this location, here, there, necessarily implied by walking and indicative of a present appropriation of space by an I, also has the function of introducing an other in relation to this I, and of thus establishing a conjunctive and disjunctive articulation of places. I would stress particularly the phatic aspect, by which I mean the function, isolated by Malinowski and Jakobson, in terms that initiate, maintain, or interrupt contact, such as hello, well, etc. Walking, which alternately follows a path and has followers, creates a mobile organicity in the environment, a sequence of phatic topoi. And if it is true that the phatic function, which is an effort to ensure communication, is already characteristic of the language of talking birds, just as it constitutes the first verbal function acquired by children, it is not surprising that it also gambols, goes on all fours, dances and walks about, with a light or heavy step, like a series of hellos in an echoing labyrinth, anterior or parallel to informative speech. The modalities of pedestrian enunciation, which a plain representation on a map brings out, could be analyzed. They include the kinds of relationship this enunciation entertains with particular paths or statements, by according them a truth value, alethic modalities of the necessary, the impossible, the possible, or the contingent, an epistemological value, epistemic modalities of the certain, the excluded, the plausible, or the questionable, or finally an ethical or legal value, deontic modalities of the obligatory, the forbidden, the permitted, or the optional. Walking affirms, suspects, tries out, transgresses, respects, etc. the trajectories it speaks. All the modalities sing a part in this chorus, changing from step to step, stepping in through proportions, sequences, and intensities which vary according to the time, the path taken, and the walker. These enunciatory operations are of an unlimited diversity. They therefore cannot be reduced to their graphic trail. Walking rhetorics. The walking of passers-by offers a series of turns, tours, and detours that can be compared to turns of phrase or stylistic figures. There is a rhetoric of walking. The art of turning phrases finds an equivalent in an art of composing a path, tourner un parcours. Like ordinary language, this art implies and combines styles and uses. Style specifies a linguistic structure that manifests on the symbolic level, an individual's fundamental way of being in the world. It connotes a singular. Use defines the social phenomenon through which a system of communication manifests itself in actual fact. It refers to a norm. Style and use both have to do with a way of operating, of speaking, walking, etc. But style involves a peculiar processing of the symbolic, while use refers to elements of a code. They intersect to form a style of use, a way of being, and a way of operating. In introducing the notion of a residing rhetoric, Rhetoric habitante, the fertile pathway opened up by A. Mesdames and systematized by S. Ostrovetsky and J. F. Ogoya, we assume that the tropes catalogued by rhetoric furnish models and hypotheses for the analysis of ways of appropriating places. Two postulates seem to me to underlie the validity of this application. One, it is assumed that practices of space also correspond to manipulations of the basic elements of a constructed order. Two, it is assumed that they are, like the tropes in rhetoric, deviations relative to a sort of literal meaning defined by the urbanistic system. There would thus be a homology between verbal figures and the figures of walking. A stylized selection among the latter is already found in the figures of dancing, insofar as both consist in treatments or operations bearing on isolatable units, and in ambiguous dispositions that divert and displace meaning in the direction of equivocalness, in the way a tremulous image confuses and multiplies the photographed object. In these two modes, the analogy can be accepted. I would add that the geometrical space of urbanists and architects seems to have the status of the proper meaning constructed by grammarians and linguists in order to have a normal and normative level to which they can compare the drifting of figurative language. In reality, this faceless proper meaning, ce propre son figure, cannot be found in current use, whether verbal or pedestrian. It is merely the fiction produced by a use that is also particular, the metalinguistic use of science that distinguishes itself by that very distinction. The long poem of walking manipulates spatial organizations, no matter how panoptic they may be. It is neither foreign to them, it can take place only within them, nor in conformity with them. It does not receive its identity from them. It creates shadows and ambiguities within them. It inserts its multitudinous references and citations into them, social models, cultural mores, personal factors. Within them, it is itself the effect of successive encounters and occasions that constantly alter it and make it the other's blazon. In other words, it is like a peddler carrying something surprising, transverse or attractive, compared with the usual choice. These diverse aspects provide the basis of a rhetoric. They can even be said to define it. By analyzing this modern art of everyday expression as it appears in accounts of spatial practices, J. F. Ogoya discerns in it two especially fundamental stylistic figures, Synecdoche and asyndeton. The predominance of these two figures seems to me to indicate, in relation to two complementary poles, a formal structure of these practices. Synecdoche consists in using a word in a sense which is part of another meaning of the same word. In essence, it names a part instead of the whole, which includes it. Thus, sail is taken for ship in the expression a fleet of 50 sails. In the same way, a brick shelter or a hill is taken for the park in the narration of a trajectory. Asyndeton is the suppression of linking words such as conjunctions and adverbs, either within a sentence or between sentences. In the same way, in walking, it selects and fragments the space traversed. It skips over links and whole parts that it omits. From this point of view, every walk constantly leaps or skips like a child hopping on one foot. It practices the ellipsis of conjunctive loci. In reality, these two pedestrian figures are related. Synecdoche expands a spatial element in order to make it play the role of a more, a totality, and take its place. The bicycle or the piece of furniture in a store window stands for a whole street or neighborhood. Asyndeton, by elision, creates a less, opens gaps in the spatial continuum, and retains only selected parts of it that amount almost to relics. Synecdoche replaces totalities by fragments, a less in the place of a more. Asyndeton disconnects them by eliminating the conjunctive or the consecutive, nothing in place of something. Synecdoche makes more dense. It amplifies the detail and miniaturizes the whole. Asyndeton cuts out. It undoes continuity and undercuts its plausibility. A space treated in this way and shaped by practices is transformed into enlarged singularities and separate islands. Through these swellings, shrinkings, and fragmentations, that is, through these rhetorical operations, a spatial phrasing of an analogical, composed of juxtaposed citations, and elliptical, made of gaps, lapses, and allusions, type is created. For the technological system of a coherent and totalizing space that is linked and simultaneous, the figures of pedestrian rhetoric substitute trajectories that have a mythical structure, at least if one understands by myth a discourse relative to the place, nowhere, or origin of concrete existence. A story jerry-built out of elements taken from common sayings, an elusive and fragmentary story whose gaps mesh with the social practices it symbolizes. Figures are the acts of this stylistic metamorphosis of space. Or rather, as Rilke puts it, they are moving trees of gestures. They move even the rigid and contrived territories of the medico-pedagogical institute in which retarded children find a place to play and dance their spatial stories. These trees of gestures are in movement everywhere. Their forests walk through the streets. They transform the scene, but they cannot be fixed in a certain place by images. If, in spite of that, an illustration were required, we could mention the fleeting images, yellowish green and metallic blue calligraphies that howl without raising their voices and emblazon themselves on the subterranean passages of the city. Embroideries composed of letters and numbers, perfect gestures of violence painted with a pistol, Shivas made of written characters, dancing graphics whose fleeting apparitions are accompanied by the rumble of subway trains. New York graffiti. If it is true that forests of gestures are manifest in the streets, their movement cannot be captured in a picture, nor can the meaning of their movements be circumscribed in a text. Their rhetorical transplantation carries away and displaces the analytical, coherent, proper meanings of urbanism. It constitutes a wandering of the semantic, produced by masses that make some parts of the city disappear and exaggerate others, distorting it, fragmenting it, and diverting it from its immobile order.